You're listening to an exclusive extract from my upcoming book, The Victorians, written and read by me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Available to pre-order in hardback, ebook and audiobook now. It's out on the 23rd of May. The pre-order link can be found in the description of this episode.
Disraeli, the One Nation Conservative. Benjamin Disraeli, 1st Earl of Beaconsfield, or Beaconsfield as he pronounced it, 21st of December 1804 to 19th of April 1881, is remembered for many striking and wildly varying aspects of his life and long career. He was a master of statecraft, and his political cunning and oratorical skills knew few rivals. He was the writer of long novels, an ability which raised eyebrows in the political world. His close friendship with Queen Victoria caused envy and no little resentment, and arguably saved the British monarchy from sinking into an abyss of unpopularity. He was one half, with William Gladstone, of a great and profound political rivalry, and there seems little doubt that the energy this rivalry generated did neither gentleman nor their respective political parties any harm. He blazed a trail as the first person born Jewish to occupy Downing Street, and as the first member of an ethnic minority to hold one of the great offices of state. Disraeli was hopeless with money, but happily he married well, in the process providing himself with the support necessary to build a lasting political career and to secure his reputation for posterity. Critically, his was the decisive influence in consolidating the modern British Conservative Party in the aftermath of its troubled birth, and it was his work that helped position the party both as a friend of the British citizen and a supporter of the British imperial adventure. He is remembered, too, as an incorrigible self-publicist, whose ability to work on his own reputation knew no bounds. While a disastrous relationship with money is never an asset to any ambitious politician, he was profoundly self-assured, and this confidence enabled him to navigate the choppiest of waters and stay dry and untroubled through it all. He was a conundrum, both to contemporary observers who watched his career narrowly and with pursed lips, and to historians today. How could such a complicated individual climb to the top of the Victorian greasy pole? Benjamin Disraeli was born into middle-class circumstances off Bedford Row in Bloomsbury in the early 19th century, when it was still being laid out as a neighbourhood of handsome squares and terraces north of London's West End. He was the second child of the Jewish scholar Isaac Disraeli, whose parents had moved from Italy in the middle of the 18th century, and his wife, Maria Basevi, whose family also had Italian Jewish antecedents. It is of no little significance that Benjamin Disraeli would later take some trouble to romanticize the roots and lineage of his father's side of the family. They were Sephardic Jews and merchants, but Disraeli, in a sign of the discomfort he felt at his lingering status as an outsider within the British elite, liked to claim that they were rather more grand, in social terms, than was the case. The elder Disraeli was a man of letters, but for his son's career, the most significant event of his life and that of his family came in 1813. In that year, a simmering quarrel with his home Bevis Marks synagogue in the City of London culminated in Isaac Disraeli's decision to remove his 5 children from the synagogue and instruction in the Jewish faith. 4 years later, in the summer of 1817, he and his wife agreed to have their children baptized as Anglicans. This was a decision momentous enough in its own right, but its ripples would run through the remainder of the life of Benjamin Disraeli. Until 1858, members of Parliament were required to swear an oath of allegiance on the true faith of a Christian, meaning that at least nominal conversion was necessary. This parental decision was thus a pivotal moment for their son. Quite simply, it made his future possible. His younger brothers would be sent to Winchester, but Benjamin did not receive this considerable advantage from his parents, and was instead dispatched to a series of rather less exalted London schools. This was presumably with the best of intentions. The young Disraeli had delicate health, and his parents would have wanted him closer to home, but this issue of his education evidently was a touchy one in Disraeli's later life. He blamed his mother for what seemed to him the most unwise of decisions. He then trained as a solicitor, and it was at this point that he and his siblings changed their surname from D'Israeli to the less complicated Disraeli, before securing admittance to Lincoln's Inn, and in 1824 to the Stock Exchange, where he began exploring the world of speculative commodity trading. This move came at what appeared to be a most auspicious moment. The disintegration of the Spanish Empire in Latin America opened the continent's mineral wealth to the world, and Disraeli was eager to have his share in what was a rapidly expanding world of commodities. He had little money of his own to fund such a financial adventure, so he entered into a financial partnership. He wrote pamphlets extolling the virtues of the investment opportunities in the Americas, and teamed up with law clerk Thomas Mullet Evans and with Robert Messer, a stockbroker's son, to purchase shares in both the Colombian mining and Anglo-Mexican mining associations. Alas for Disraeli and his partners, the shares in both companies began almost at once to fall sharply, while the Lord Chancellor started to examine the actions of those individuals seen as promoting bubble investments, threatening them with prosecution under the South Sea Bubble Act. By the summer of 1825, Disraeli and his partners had lost over £7,000, at that time a vast sum. It was the beginning of a pattern of debt accumulation for Disraeli. His debts to Messer were not repaid until 1849, and for many years he was obliged to rely on his father's pocket and on the cultivation of wealthy friends in order to make ends meet. Poor and unwise investment is not a particular sin, and the most intelligent people can fall victim. Sir Isaac Newton, for example, had joined the South Sea Bubble in 1720, just before its collapse. But Disraeli threw his weight behind an enterprise without doing due diligence on it. He publicly extolled the virtues of companies he ought to have known were worthless. That he did so to boost the value of his own investment and to save himself from further losses is an activity that would now be illegal and subject to fierce regulatory penalty. This disagreeable episode stands as one of the early debits against Disraeli's name, and his detractors have used this to denigrate his reputation. Disraeli's dire financial straits led directly to the development of another thread in an already distinctive life. He took to writing novels, noting within the burgeoning ranks of middle-class Britons a wish to peep into the more exalted lives of the aristocracy. Fulfilling such a wish might make some money, and a first novel was duly forthcoming. Vivian Grey was published anonymously in 4 volumes between 1826 and 1827, and it sold well too, but soon the critics noted aspects of the book that did not please. The writer purported to tell a story of aristocratic life, the reviewers complained, but that story was littered with errors and solecisms, revealing the writer to be a fraud and outsider, rather than the insider telling a story of a world known well. Which was the truth, for Disraeli did not yet move in exalted circles, and such criticism must have stung. It did so even more when Disraeli was unmasked as the author, and his reputation received lasting damage. Not that the criticism he received stopped him writing. One novel followed another for the rest of his life, with Sybil or The Two Nations, 1845, perhaps the most famous. His need for funds also meant that Disraeli borrowed from almost anyone willing to lend to him. Thus he developed a friendship with Benjamin and Sarah Austin. Benjamin Austin was a lawyer for whom Disraeli had worked, and Disraeli was said by uncharitable observers to have flirted with Sarah Austin in order to extract loans from her husband. These loans, which ultimately had to be repaid by Isaac Disraeli, were not inconsiderable. At Christmas 1833, Austin lent Disraeli £1,200, and in 1837 the two fell out permanently. Nor did these regular transfusions stop his finances deteriorating, even though he applied to his father for 2 more loans and was chased around Buckinghamshire during a by-election in 1837 by his creditors. By 1841, Disraeli was at least £20,000 in debt from his own extravagances and from the high interest on past loans. His income was not large enough to sustain such levels of debt. Even his entry to Parliament in 1837, as one of the 2 Tory members for Maidstone, did not help his case, for MPs in those days did not draw a salary, and Disraeli's finances remained in a parlous state until his marriage. Marriage, however, would not come until 1839, and in the meantime his private life continued on its strikingly unconventional course. He had taken a tour of pleasure to southern Europe and the Levant in 1830-31 in the company of his sister's fiancé, William Meredith. the tour had to be truncated when Meredith died of smallpox in Egypt, and Disraeli himself returned to England, requiring treatment for an unpleasant disease. The tour nonetheless expanded his horizons and alerted him to the wideness of the world and to the pleasures that might be taken from it. His private life was for some time thereafter more Regency than Victorian. Take his affair with Henrietta Sykes, the wife of the wealthy Berkshire landowner Sir Francis Sykes, whom he first met in 1834. This was carried out openly for 2 years, in a way that could have been catastrophic for his future prospects. The connection between them would give psychiatrists a field day, for Lady Sykes signed off a letter to Disraeli as "your mother." Sir Francis, who had a mistress of his own, was mainly unconcerned by the affair, but on one occasion he banned his wife from seeing Disraeli again. However, this order was promptly rescinded when Henrietta called at the house of her husband's mistress and found him there with her. This led to an accommodation. However, Lady Sykes' visits to the Disraeli family home at Bradenham near High Wycombe, where Benjamin Disraeli continued to live with his parents, scandalised polite Buckinghamshire society. Later, Sir Francis would bring proceedings for criminal conversation against the prominent Irish painter Daniel Maclise, whom he had caught in flagrante delicto with his wife. Although the case did not go ahead, the thought that a similar case could have seen Disraeli pursued through the courts before his political career had taken off shows what a risk he was taking. Disraeli, characteristically, turned the episode into a novel, barely troubling to offer a disguise. Henrietta Temple was published in 1837. Disraeli also needed money to fund his political ambitions. Prior to his success at Maidstone, he had stood as a radical in the elections of 1831 and 1832, declaring that the Tory faction at Westminster was old and worn out. Yet he could not and would not be a Whig. His politics at this time, however, defied easy categorization. He favoured the extension of the franchise, yet he also favoured protectionism. From 1834 onwards, he began gravitating decisively towards Tory politics. In the following year, he stood as a radical for the last time on his home turf of High Wycombe, and in the same year he stood for the first time as a Tory for the constituency of Taunton, where he incurred the enmity of the Irish leader Daniel O'Connell, who had misunderstood a newspaper report and concluded that Disraeli had been maligning him. O'Connell was well able to malign in return, dismissing Disraeli as a reptile just fit now, after being twice discarded by the people, to become a Conservative, and continuing for some time in the same vigorous vein. Mutual mudslinging followed, but all publicity is good publicity, and the quarrel did Disraeli no harm. He did not win Taunton, but he came close, and he propelled himself to public notice for the first time. His victory at Maidstone followed within 2 calendar years. When marriage at last took place in 1839, it brought a degree of order and stability to Disraeli's life, and it also provided vital cash. Mary Ann Lewis was 12 years older than her suitor, and was the widow of the rich parliamentarian Wyndham Lewis, an associate of Disraeli, with whom he had shared the Maidstone parliamentary seat. Later Disraeli freely admitted that he had courted her with her money in mind. "When I first made my advances to you," he told her, "I was influenced by no romantic feeling." And the fact is that he found her money not merely useful, but essential for his political career. Fortunately, for both husband and wife, Lewis had tied his estate up carefully. Mary Ann Lewis had no control over her assets in those days before the passing of the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, and this was just as well. There is every chance that Disraeli, given the opportunity and his record, would have run through it all quite quickly. Yet there was money available, enough for Disraeli to pay an estimated £13,000 off his debts. He also showed signs of real devotion to his wife, whose sweet voice, he wrote in the dedication to Sybil, has often encouraged, and whose taste and judgment has ever guided its pages, the most severe of critics, but a perfect wife. She certainly was devoted. Once, having caught her hand painfully in a carriage door, she held her tongue rather than put her husband off his speech. Such was her support for him that Disraeli praised her habit of having supper ready for him following late-night sittings at the Commons as being more like a mistress than a wife. This was the stability that Disraeli needed and craved. He did not stop his flirtations with other ladies, and he continued a correspondence with a number of close female friends. But Mary Ann was his great support. She was an unusual lady, spirited, plain-spoken, and a chatterbox, although not as educated as she could have been. Disraeli said she did not know who came first, the Greeks or the Romans. She was also that priceless political asset, a popular wife. People liked her, and she made it possible for Disraeli to achieve his ambition. It is difficult to imagine how he could have pursued his career without her moral as well as financial support. Marriage released his energies entirely for political ends, and once Sir Robert Peel became Prime Minister in 1841, Disraeli went to the centre of events. Benjamin Disraeli's relationship with Peel caused the greatest damage to Disraeli's reputation. Although skilled with language, Disraeli attacked Peel with an excessive degree of vituperation against the policies and strategies of a gentleman who was older, who had earned the respect of many colleagues and the friendship of Prince Albert, who possessed a wealth of experience and who was a statesman of some standing. Disraeli's boldness ruffled feathers at Westminster and bestowed on the younger man a reputation for excess. The relationship had begun fairly well. In the election of 1841, Disraeli switched seats from Maidstone to Shrewsbury. He harboured from the first ambitions for ministerial office, but these were not met by the new Prime Minister. Disraeli waited his moment on the backbenches with something that might have resembled patience. Moreover, he thought he shared with Peel a fair amount of common ground at this time. Peel did not flourish his changing opinions on the question of free trade until 1845, so there was, for the moment, little in the Prime Minister's words to vex Disraeli. He instead used his time networking and cultivating a reputation for foreign policy nous. He also began to develop an overtly paternalistic political philosophy, the forerunner of what later became known as Nation Conservatism. His opinion was that the Tories must pressure landowners to ally with the working class against the rising mercantile middle classes. The landowners could protect the workers from exploitation by business and could claim their loyalty in defence of the status quo in return. He would in time have the chance to put this philosophy into practice. As Peel began to show his hand, so Disraeli identified a new enemy, the Prime Minister. The parliamentary confrontation between Peel and Disraeli over the question of the repeal of the Corn Laws and the scaling back of British protectionism are among the most celebrated and notorious of the annals of Westminster. Peel himself was an effective operator, and Disraeli was never able to offer a convincing reply to Peel's question, why was he, ready as I think he was, to unite his fortunes with mine in office? He responded to Peel's remark in the Commons with an outright lie, claiming that he never sought office even though he had written to Peel to beg for a position both for himself and on a separate occasion for his brother. Nor can there be any question of a misunderstanding. Disraeli's phraseology was unequivocal and untrue. Hansard recorded these words. I can assure the House nothing of the kind ever occurred. I never shall. It is totally foreign to my nature, make an application for any place. I never asked a favour of the government, not even one of those mechanical things which persons are obliged to ask, and as regards myself, I never directly or indirectly solicited office. He then went on to say that if offered a ministerial position, he might have accepted, but with respect to my being a solicitor for office, it is entirely unfounded. Remarkably, Peel was believed to have had Disraeli's letter asking for promotion in his pocket, and there was no satisfactory explanation for his failure to use it. It has been speculated that the gentlemanly Peel found it distasteful to read the contents of a private letter into the public record and in the House of Commons, yet the strength and inaccuracy of Disraeli's rebuttal was surely sufficient to excuse any use of private correspondence. Disraeli's conduct in this instance was flawed on every count. He had no reason beyond pious hope to expect early preferment from Peel. There were many better claimants, and his direct lies would, if exposed, have easily derailed his whole career. His credibility in Tory circles would have collapsed, not that at this point he had a great deal anyway. As with his youthful financial speculations and his relationships with married women, so his words in the Commons constituted a reckless gamble that was within a hair's breadth of being catastrophic. Imagine the scene, with Peel's hand hovering over his waistcoat pocket, the elder statesman wondering whether he ought to pull out the evidence of Disraeli's dishonesty and cashier him, and declining to do so. Consider the irony of it. Following his escape, Disraeli went on to destroy Peel. This question of economic reform has already been considered from Peel's point of view, and needs to be examined from Disraeli's side too. Disraeli's ferocious attacks on Peel only in part stemmed from chagrin at ambitions stymied. For the most part, they emanated from the great clash stamped through the politics of the time, protectionism versus free trade. It is crucial to remember that there was much at stake. For its proponents, the system of protectionism was a noble cause. It was bound up with great issues of patriotism and national security, and there was every reason to advance such a view. The Corn Laws had been an intrinsic part of national life for 2 generations. The University of Warwick estimates that in 1841, in spite of developing industrialization and urbanization, the agricultural economy still represented 22.1% of British GDP. In 1814, the Committee of the House of Commons had determined that the fair price for corn was 80 shillings a quarter. Its deliberations had been much influenced by the contemporary economist Robert Malthus, who argued that domestic production was needed to ensure supply in times of scarcity, and that no sovereign nation should find itself at the mercy of foreign countries cutting off their food supply. If the 80-shilling minimum were not kept, the theory went, then wages would have to be lowered or jobs lost, reducing purchasing power and hitting the manufacturing sector as well. The free trade advocate and political economist David Ricardo, footnote, it is fascinating to speculate how much Ricardo influenced Peel as they served in the Bullion Committee together in 1819, end of footnote. He argued that such theories did not stand up to scrutiny. Foreign governments would not cut off supplies when they wanted and needed the money and the benefits trade brought them, and the British, he added, ought to use their superior purchasing power to effect positive change. At this time, however, Malthus proved the more convincing economist. The 1815 Act accepted the 80-shilling protection level. Above this amount, there would be no tariff, and below it, importation would be banned. The system did not please even its proponents, but systematic government tweaking maintained its utility as the years went by, and saw to it that cheap corn from expanding agricultural areas elsewhere in the world did not flood the market. The key line for supporters was that imports of grain were to be readily available during the poor harvests of 1828 to 31, while imports were pegged back during the bumper years between 1832 and 1835. Unfortunately, a combination of bad harvests and a manufacturing recession in 1836 led to the resumption of pressure to change or repeal the Corn Laws. The Anti-Corn Law League was founded in Manchester in the autumn of 1838, with a London meeting in the following year. These meetings pushed a simple and attractive message: cheap bread. The use of new campaigning techniques and the greater ease of communication via the penny post and the railways enabled the Leaguers to disseminate this message with great efficiency, and even the resumption of good harvests in the first half of the 1840s could not now remove the growing pressure for a fundamental change in the system. The dramatic point to be made is that both the protectionist and the free trade sides could offer compelling arguments in their favour. After all, both Ricardo and Malthus were convincing and valued economists, and their names resonate to this day. Malthus's basic proposition that we may run out of food if the population continues to grow is widely accepted, and although the historic record shows that mankind can cope with its own increase, still, some people worry that we will be unable to feed ourselves. It was not in 1846 wholly irrational or merely opportunistic to be on the same side of the argument as Malthus, who represented the mainstream political view at least until 1840, rather than Ricardo. Moreover, as is so often the case with economic policies, many politicians had not especially strong views against received wisdom. Lord Melbourne's famous description of collective responsibility, quoted by constitutionalists throughout the ages, was based on the issue of the Corn Laws. Now, Is it to lower the price of corn, or isn't it? It's not much matter which we say, but mind, we must all say the same. In the specific instance of the Corn Laws, however, it should be noted that Melbourne's view did settle on a position, and in 1839 he remarked that repeal was the wildest and maddest scheme that ever entered into the imagination of man. As for Peel, his political trajectory provides an example of how received wisdom can change as the tides change eventually. He entered the 1841 election committed to retaining the Corn Laws before executing a sharp political turn. He had observed the success of reducing duties in other areas, and this appears to have convinced him of the benefits of removing them on corn. In addition, the disaster of the Great Famine in Ireland led Peel to feel the need to soften the tariffs at once, and then to acknowledge to the Cabinet and himself that he could see no prospect, once they were suspended, of reimposing them. This decision by Peel has been thoroughly vindicated by history, but it does not follow that opposition to it was automatically vexatious and opportunistic. The joke at the time was, why are the Tories like walnuts? Because they are troublesome to peel. That was the fraught context of the 1840s in a nutshell, and it left a good deal of scope for politicians to act on the basis of principle. This may be hard to believe about Disraeli, but not about his ally, Lord George Bentinck, who went on to become the main figure of the anti-repeal Tories in Parliament. Bentinck was no natural leader. Until he rose to speak against repeal, he had not uttered a word in Parliament in the course of 18 years. He was irked by the sense that his leader, Peel, stood revealed as a liar and a cheat, and that he, Bentinck, had therefore been elected to Parliament on the basis of a lie. His rigorous moral code shone through as he opposed repeal in spite of the personal advantage it would have brought. He said, "I keep horses in 3 counties, and they tell me I shall save £1,500 a year by free trade. I don't care for that. What I cannot bear is being sold." He had even been offered office by Peel, so had no sense of personal slight, and to concentrate on politics he sold his horses, one of which went on to win the Derby, depriving him of his life's ambition. This country gentleman now threw his lot in with Disraeli to oppose repeal. He provided what seemed a calm, stout English foundation to the movement, bringing in allies who were wary of Disraeli himself, but who would follow a man with aristocratic gilding and the patience to do the quiet but necessary organisational work. Disraeli could now set to work on his rhetorical prowess, and we must do him the justice of remembering that he might genuinely have believed in the arguments against the repeal of the Corn Laws. After all, their repeal did little to help relieve the famine in Ireland. On the 22nd of January, 1846, Disraeli rounded on Peel in the Commons. In his speech, he underlined his own consistency, noting that, "To those opinions I have expressed in this House in favour of protection, I adhere. They sent me to this House, and if I had relinquished them, I should have relinquished my seat also." He called for the repealers to listen to the unequivocal expression of the public voice. He then moved to attack Peel for his inconsistency in supporting the Corn Laws by eloquent panegyrics on the existing system, the plenty it had caused, the rural happiness it had diffused. He also mocked Peel for his previous changes of heart over Catholic emancipation and parliamentary reform. Then he began to abuse the Prime Minister. Peel, he said, might as well at once adopt the phraseology of Walpole and call himself a sole minister, for his speech was rich in egotistic rhetoric. He expressed his bitterness at Peel's present arguments. What were the means, what the machinery by which the right-on gentleman acquired his position, how he obtained power to turn around upon his supporters and treat them with contempt and disdain? Would his sovereign have called on Peel if in 1841 he had not placed himself, as he said, at the head of the gentlemen of England, supporting the sacred cause of protection? Disraeli was scathing about the reality of Peel's change of mind. The gentleman who has had the question of protection before his official mind in every shape that ingenuity could devise, during his parliamentary career of a quarter of a century, this gentleman suddenly finds that the arguments in favour of protection to native industry are not, after all, so cogent as he once thought them. He discovers that the principle of protection cannot be supported. The future of which they are thinking is indeed posterity, or only the coming quarter day. What I cannot endure is to hear a man come down and say, "I will rule without respect of party, though I rose by party, and I care not for your judgment, for I look to posterity." The minister who attained as he did the position which the right-hon baronet now fills is not the minister who ought to abrogate the Corn Laws. History has given this battle to Peel. The Corn Laws were repealed, yet Disraeli did have a point. Not only did he argue that economically the Corn Laws had worked, but in addition Peel split his party. He and his Peelite faction would eventually join the Whigs and liberal-minded politicians in Parliament to form the Liberal Party. Disraeli would remain with the core Conservatives, weaker and unable to govern independently for a generation. The telling line is perhaps when Disraeli remarked that Peel is not the minister who ought to abrogate the Corn Laws. There is an undoubted virtue in a politician being flexible enough to change his mind, but there is also reasonable criticism to be made of one who abandons his previous position on which he stood successfully for election. Sir Robert Peel both issued the first election manifesto and made the first great U-turn. While it is possible that Peel may be regarded as a statesman because he was willing to change his mind, so Disraeli can be thought one because he stuck to his election promises. The recent view of Benjamin Disraeli, much influenced by Lord Blake's biography of 1966, is that he was essentially an opportunist with a disreputable early life and a selfish later one, and a man guided solely by personal ambition. Yet to achieve what he did, Disraeli had to overcome greater barriers than any of his contemporaries. In the first place, politics was not exclusively an aristocratic profession, but it was dominated by the noble families. Even being a Member of Parliament required property ownership. Although the likes of Peel, Disraeli's grand opponent, and Disraeli's nemesis William Gladstone were not of noble stock, they cannot be placed in the same bracket as Disraeli either. They held the priceless advantage of coming from exceptionally successful commercial families and were educated at Harrow and Eton respectively. Disraeli invented a noble history for his family, and his imagination must have at least persuaded him, although nobody else, that he was the equal of any number of blue-blooded politicians. Nor can Disraeli's Jewish heritage be ignored. At least since the days of Oliver Cromwell, Britain has thankfully never been a hotbed of anti-Semitism. But his identity was nevertheless a drag on his ambitions. Had his father not fallen out with the synagogue and chosen to have his children join the Church of England, Disraeli's Jewish faith would have been an insurmountable obstacle to a political career in the first half of the 19th century. Lionel de Rothschild, who made so important a contribution to the success of the Great Exhibition, was forbidden from taking his seat in the Commons because he would not renounce his Judaism, even though he was repeatedly elected. Only in 1858, 11 years after his first election, did the House of Lords relent and permit each house to draw up its own oath of allegiance. This enabled Rothschild to take his seat at last as a Liberal and the first Jewish Member of Parliament. Disraeli had participated in this long-running debate, and it is to his very great credit that he sided with the Liberals, antagonizing some of his Tory supporters in the process. He argued not merely in favour of tolerance, but essentially that Judaism and Christianity were equally important, a remarkably challenging view, particularly for him to take in the circumstances of the 1850s. Disraeli's argument could only have highlighted his own sense of foreignness, and he never sought to disguise his family antecedents. If anything, he made a virtue of them. He was capable of principle, in other words, and it is against this background that his mistakes must be judged and his successes applauded. It is as if the minuses have been piled up, with the result that his reputation has been overtaken by those of Gladstone and Peel. Yet once it is recognised that it is disproportionate to view his opposition to repeal of the Corn Laws as exclusively opportunistic, his successes can be explored with a greater sense of justice. The formal foundation and naming of the Conservative Party is correctly attributed to Peel, but it was Disraeli who developed both its structures and the policies that allowed it to appeal to the legions of newly enfranchised voters. He hauled the party back from the nadir of its Peelite split and made it electable again. As for his political beliefs, these have been hidden in clear sight, for they went well beyond a desire for self-promotion, imbuing the Conservative Party with a range of values that have been quoted favourably ever since. Unusually, he disseminated these ideas through his novels, which flowed with his political ideology. He referred to Coningsby, or The New Generation, 1844, which tells the story of a character who seems a cross between Lionel de Rothschild and Disraeli himself, as The Secret History of My Feelings, while the full title of his next novel, Sybil, or The Two Nations, encapsulates what Disraeli felt to be the abiding curse of British society, one that Nation Conservatives could help to dispel. His writing attempted to replace a progressivist, Whig interpretation of history with his own conservative version, which in turn attempted to heal the wounds in British society and to bring the two nations together. Disraeli also invested a good deal of creative and political energy in describing a past consisting of a feudal idyll. He held, or claimed to hold, the view that there had once been a golden age in Britain when the interests of landowners and their tenants went hand in glove. One looked after the interests of the other, which in return gave fealty not out of fear, but from love. Disraeli's was part of a great common vision, which a host of others, including Augustus Pugin, shared. It was a concept of a kinder, gentler, and more balanced past that might be resurrected if the will existed. For Disraeli, there was a personal twist. He not only believed that the Golden Age was about to awaken, but he also had no doubt that he was the man to bring it back to life. In Sybil, for example, he wrote that this vision, this golden Toryism, was not dead but sleeping, yet will rise from the tomb to bring back strength to the crown, liberty to the subject, and to announce that power has only one duty, to secure the social welfare of the people. Such a position, Disraeli considered, needed to be revived because the current situation was so divisive. Again, in Sybil, the novel's hero Egremont met a stranger who explained to him the situation. Egremont declared in a pious statement of patriotic sentiment, "Say what you will, our queen reigns over the greatest nation that ever existed." The stranger's question of which nation puzzled Egremont, and he listened as the stranger then went on to describe the existence of two nations, between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings, as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by different breeding, are fed by different food, and are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. "You speak of," said Egremont hesitatingly, "the rich and the poor." The reader today may find Disraeli's reliance on such verbiage a trifle trying, but there is no doubt that this is the clearest possible description of his concerns about the divisions in society, ones which had in part, he argued, come about because of the lack of power of the landed interest and the growth of industrialization, which had broken the historic bonds. In Coningsby, meanwhile, Disraeli took the opportunity to shape further his vision of a renewed golden age, on this occasion deploying a dialogue between the hero and his grandfather, Lord Monmouth. To make his point, Monmouth, who expected Peel to make him a duke, is rebuked by his grandson, who declares, "What we want, sir, is not to fashion new dukes and furbish up old baronies, but to establish great principles which may maintain the realm and secure the happiness of the people. Let me see authority once more honoured, a solemn reverence against the habit of our lives. Let me see property acknowledging, as in the days of faith, that labour is his twin brother, and that the essence of all tenure is the performance of duty." His grandfather was not inclined to listen to this lecture, but he was not the hero of the novel. It is difficult not to admire the boldness of a politician who was able to write a bracing novel as a thundering manifesto. The essential point of all this is that Disraeli needed to encapsulate a view of the world that would win the approval of his divided party, and that his achievement was to do so. After all, he set out an amazingly attractive proposition, which cast the anti-Peelite faction as historic heroes abandoned by an awful leader who was really nothing more than a Whig in disguise. He had remarked of Peel that "the right honourable gentleman caught the Whigs bathing and walked away with their clothes." His view was of a gentle and paternalistic Conservative party which brought the two nations together. Is it too much to suggest that even as early as the 1840s, Disraeli had seen the future for the Tory party in the light of a widening franchise? That he had recognised that the Conservatives had to unite the classes to survive, and that the first step was to persuade the landed class that its interest was to be the protectors of labour? If Disraeli had such foresight, or even saw the glimmerings of the way democracy was developing, the next Reform Act in 1867 suddenly seems much less opportunistic and instead a part of his long-term ideal. For it is undoubtedly the case that the consequences of this act, which both Lord Derby, the minority Conservative Prime Minister of the day, and Disraeli, the legislation's chief architect, referred to as a leap in the dark, were seismic. As a consequence of its passing, some 938,000 voters were added to the electoral roll. At a stroke, it almost doubled the 1,056,000 roll of existing voters. How did this act come about? The usual answer is by accident, with a minority government desperate to remain in office, willing to give anything away to win individual votes. Disraeli's authoritative biographer, Lord Blake, called it one of the oddest histories of confusion, cross-purposes and muddle in British political history. While Roy, Lord Jenkins of Hill Head, in his important biography of William Gladstone, saw Disraeli's primary aim as being to outfox his enemy. Jenkins wrote that Gladstone failed to realise that Disraeli's governing tactic was to defeat any amendment from Gladstone, even if it meant accepting a more extreme one from another source. He had to show that he was winning, and this meant showing that Gladstone was losing. The process of the bill was tortuous. The Victorian House of Commons did not have time limits on speeches and did not timetable debates. This meant that any member could speak for as long as he liked, and the fashion of the day was to be long-winded. In addition, party discipline was also less clear-cut than it is today. Members were willing to vote according to their own or local interests, and were also prepared to be explicit about this. These parliamentary difficulties had led to the defeat of attempts at electoral reform tabled by Russell's Liberal government, a defeat in which Disraeli played a leading role, and Derby becoming Prime Minister. The Russell Bill had been championed by Gladstone, and its defeat led to massive protests around the country. Some 200,000 people gathered to protest in Birmingham, for example, and politicians across the House realised that in such a climate, reform would be only a matter of time, regardless of the complexion of the government. As Jenkins noted, it certainly was one of the ironies of history that Disraeli, who would shortly go on to pilot his own radical electoral reforms through Parliament, was the key player in foiling Gladstone's rather less far-reaching plans. To do so, he worked with people with whom he had no natural affinity, such as Robert Lowe, a Liberal politician, but one who opposed any further extension of democracy to defeat Russell and Gladstone. This operation involved a delicate balancing act. Lowe and his supporters were known as the Adullamites, in a biblical allusion to the cave of Adullam, where David had sought refuge from King Saul, by their enemies on account of their backward, hence cave-dwelling political views. They did not want to bring down Russell's government, but they were desperate to halt further electoral reform. In the end, Disraeli had his way. Russell's government did collapse, and Derby formed a new minority administration, with Disraeli installed as Chancellor. Disraeli's own research quietly demonstrated that his idea of supporting the extension of the franchise would benefit the Conservatives, even if some of his fellow party members remained to be convinced. Yet he had no firm plans as to how to go about this, so, with Russell's administration swept away and Derby in government, Disraeli was forced rapidly to come up with a scheme for reform. There have been quarrels about Disraeli's real place in this scheme. Blake argues that it was Derby, with the discreet support of the Queen, who pushed for reform, while Disraeli was dragged along. However, looking at the broader context, this may not be correct. After all, once the bill was tabled in the Commons, Disraeli gave way consistently to all attempts to widen the scope of reform until the lists of newly enfranchised voters reached close to the million mark. These are unlikely to be the moves of a reluctant politician. Faced with such wide-ranging reform, however, the cabinet split, and a rash of significant resignations followed. Disraeli may have been willing to do anything to stay in office, but with a majority of 70 against him in the Commons, he knew that the odds were stacked heavily against him. He played his hand now with great skill, lowered the standing of Gladstone, divided the ranks of the opposition, and even, diplomatically, rejected the proposals of the Queen that the whole question ought to be decided by a committee of the Privy Council on a non-party basis. In addition, he published his speeches on this subject in order to claim the credit for reform. Eventually, Disraeli's manoeuvres paid off. The Reform Bill received royal assent in August 1867. It seems that Disraeli did have a private master plan, which was to make it appear that Derby was the one pushing for reform, while Disraeli was a secondary actor, thus making it much easier for him to carry those Tories suspicious of the whole idea. Nonetheless, to win any vote against his bitter political enemy Gladstone must have been a source of joy to Disraeli. There are further pieces of evidence to back up such a theory. Disraeli had an interesting relationship with the reformer and Liberal MP John Bright, who remarked of him, "He conceives it right to strive for a great career with such principles as are in vogue in his age and country, says the politics and principles to suit England must be of the English type, but having obtained power, would use it to found a great reputation on great services rendered to the country." Bright, of all people, had no particular political need to opine positively on the scope of Disraeli's vision, and for this reason is worth listening to. In spite of these great reforms, the Conservatives lost the general election of 1868. Disraeli had, in February of that year, at last achieved his aim of becoming Prime Minister. A gouty Lord Derby resigned on health grounds, and Disraeli was summoned to Osborne to receive the all-important invitation from Victoria. "Mr. Disraeli as Prime Minister," the Queen wrote to her daughter Vicky in Prussia, "a proud thing for a man risen from the people to have obtained." His triumph was short, for the election of that December saw Gladstone's Liberals returned with a large majority, and Disraeli retreated to the opposition benches to await Liberal mistakes and to spend his leisure time writing yet another novel. Lothair was published in 1870. Crucially, Disraeli used the time to consolidate the organisation of the Conservative Party, both centrally and in the constituencies. It was at this time that Conservative Central Office evolved as the prime organisation power in the party, with sub-bodies established to reinforce its power and influence in the country. One such was the National Union of Conservative and Constitutional Associations, that tentacle of Central Office in charge of organising within newly enfranchised urban communities, and if possible, claiming the loyalty of these communities to the party. The union was brought to life when Disraeli deployed it to support his two great speeches of 1872, one in the Manchester Free Trade Hall and the other in the Crystal Palace, which now stood at Sydenham in South London. In both speeches, he excoriated Gladstone's Liberal government, describing the front bench as a range of exhausted volcanoes, not a flame flickers on a single pallid crest. The crowds roared their approval, but Disraeli's principal focus in these speeches was not to attack Gladstone, rather to set out the Conservatives' own distinctive stall, to maintain the institutions of Britain, to elevate the condition of the people, and to uphold empire. At the Crystal Palace, on the 24th of June, he told the crowd, "It must be obvious to all who consider the condition of the multitude with a desire to improve and elevate it, that no important step can be gained unless you can effect some reduction of their hours of labour and humanize their toil. The great problem is to be able to achieve such results without violating those principles of economic truths upon which the prosperity of all states depends." He argued that reforms had indeed been achieved by early Conservative laws in the teeth of opposition by the blatant and loud-mouthed leaders of the Liberal Party. He focused on the sense that capital has never accumulated so quickly, that wages were never higher, that the employment of the people was never greater, and the country never wealthier. All of this was a prelude to the main plank of Disraeli's offer of a new social vision. His central theme was that the health of the people was the most important question for a statesman. It has many branches. It involves the state of the dwellings of the people, their enjoyment of some of the chief elements of nature, air, light, and water. It involves the regulation of their industry, the inspection of their toil. It involves the purity of their provisions, and it touches upon all the means by which you may wean them from the habits of excess and brutality. Responding to disdainful Liberal remarks that he was obsessed by the nation's sewers, Disraeli turned such scorn to good use, claiming that, "To one of the labouring multitude of England, who has found fear always to be one of the inmates of his household, who has, year after year, seen stricken down the children of his loins, on whose sympathy and material support he has looked with hope and confidence, it is not a policy of sewerage, but a question of life and death." This was forceful rhetoric, not least because it was true. His view of the multitude, in possession of personal privilege, of personal rights and liberties, which are not enjoyed by the aristocracies of other countries, was uniting in tone, and his vision for the nation was optimistic. "The issue is, whether you will be content to be a comfortable England, modelled and moulded upon continental principles, and meeting in due course an inevitable fate, or whether you will be a great country, an imperial country, a country where your sons, when they rise to paramount positions, obtain not merely the esteem of their countrymen, but command the respect of the world." It was something else, too. It was a manifesto for office, delivered 2 years out from the next general election. It is also to Disraeli's great credit that when the Conservatives were returned to power in 1874, at the head of their first clear election victory in over 30 years, its provisions were to a large extent carried out. Disraeli clearly drove the organisational reform and the policy direction. He set a great many activities in motion, but as Prime Minister he has not in recent years been fully acknowledged for what his administration did. His subordinates have been seen as the workhorses, leaving Disraeli perceived as something of a show pony. Is this really fair? Or does the clockmaker deserve some credit when the clock tells the right time, even if it is wound every week by another? Under Disraeli's period of office, the Trade Union Act was introduced by Home Secretary Richard Ashton Cross. It was more favourable to organised labour than Gladstone's equivalent Act of 1871 had been. Cross also promoted the Artisans and Labourers' Dwellings Improvements Act, which allowed slum dwellings to be compulsorily purchased by councils and demolished, and provided for inexpensive loans to construct up-to-date dwellings. This was a stepping stone to further enlightened housing legislation, with the result that Robert Ensor describes the Act as one of the milestones in English legislation on the housing problem. A Sale of Food and Drugs Act remained the principal legislation in this area until 1928, and a Public Health Act, which tackled the issue of sewage as promised by Disraeli, remained a central element in sanitary law until 1937. Each of these acts was excellent law, and each one was passed in 1875, ironically leading to criticism that nothing much happened in the rest of this period of government. However, 4 key social acts covering labour laws, housing, food safety and public health is a pretty impressive haul for any administration. Most crucially, they link directly with all that Disraeli himself had said throughout his career. He must be allowed to take much of the credit for the passage of such legislation. As for Disraeli's foreign and imperial policies, these too were successful. They pivot around the decisions which flowed from the Congress of Berlin, which convened in the German capital in the summer of 1878, and in which Disraeli was a prime mover. The Congress brought the 6 European great powers of the day, Britain herself plus Austria, France, Germany, Russia and Italy, together with the Ottoman Empire and the Balkan states of Serbia, Montenegro, Greece and Romania, with the intention of delineating the territories of the Balkans in the years to come. The Congress has been much criticised for being essentially a stitch-up, with all the main decisions made before it even met, and for settling affairs in Southeast Europe so poorly that grudges and rivalries were permitted to fester unchecked. It then erupted in the form of the First and Second Balkan Wars, and eventually the Great War itself. Blake, who was not a Disraeli sympathiser, was clear. The Congress was by no means a stitch-up. He wrote that it is a myth to suggest that the Congress was a mere facade, registering decisions already taken in secret between the principal powers concerned. It can equally be argued that, as a concerted effort to keep peace in Europe, it did what it set out to do. There was peace for another 30 years. This was no mean feat, given the vicious state of affairs in the Balkans, in this, as in so many eras. Disraeli, now 73, was at an age when the energy required for such an important event may have been ebbing. Notwithstanding this, he sensibly travelled slowly to Berlin and was full of enthusiasm for negotiations. He and the formidable German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck came to admire each other. Bismarck famously made the quip, "Der alte Jude, das ist der Mann," the old Jew, he is the man, which provides an indication of his opinion of Disraeli. Indeed, it is almost a commentary on the Congress itself, given that Disraeli achieved most of his foreign policy objectives. The new state of Bulgaria, before the Congress and expansionist satellite of Russia, was reined in and its Aegean coastline removed. At a stroke, Russian influence in the eastern Mediterranean was trimmed considerably. The Ottoman Empire, a bulwark, albeit a failing one, against Russia in the region, was propped up a little longer, and Britain took control of the strategic island of Cyprus. Disraeli also scored a point off Gladstone, whose views of the Ottomans, stemming from their massacres of Christians in the Balkans in 1876, were understandably harsh. The view in London was that the Congress was a triumph. Disraeli returned a hero and was offered a dukedom by the Queen, plus accession to the Order of the Garter. He declined the dukedom, but accepted the Garter on the second occasion it was offered. In this period as Prime Minister, Disraeli also delivered on other Conservative plans. He was a clear and public supporter of the monarchy. His support was somewhat ostentatious, for his friendship with Victoria enabled him to float the suggestion that she emerge from the seclusion that had followed the death of Albert, and show herself to her people, and that she agree to his proposal that she be proclaimed the Empress of India. It is easy to ridicule Disraeli's flattery of the Queen in these years, flattery which he laid on with a trowel, but it is less easy to dismiss the suggestion that he revitalised the monarchy at a time when public support for the institution was low. The friendship between minister and monarch was much observed and commented upon, with the pair featuring in many newspaper cartoons. The people were understandably cross at the thought that they had a queen, the so-called Widow of Windsor, who was seldom seen. Victoria had been in mourning for the loss of Albert for the best part of 20 years, and had forced the court to mourn likewise. If the Queen was essentially invisible, the thinking went, then what was the point of having a monarch at all? Victoria was, moreover, inclined to be difficult. She resented not being kept informed, but she equally resented being overworked. Disraeli gossiped with her, conspired with her, and in general worked to bring her cheer. In helping Victoria to take suitable steps, Disraeli did his sovereign and the state considerable service. The reason for doing this was that he fully understood the role and function of a constitutional monarchy, and he knew that the monarchy, if well managed, possessed a magic that could unite the nation. In constitutional terms, he adhered to Bagehot's insight that the uncodified British constitution required both a visible sovereign, in the words of our present Queen, "I must be seen to be believed," and one so far above the fray that she was a focus for patriotism. To this recipe, Disraeli further added his own flamboyance. As with the nation, so with the empire. Victoria could unify both entities and bring them together. Her new role as Empress of India would command the fealty of her colonial subjects, to whom she must inevitably appear as a distant figure. Disraeli had theatrical flair. He possessed the impresario's feel for what the people wanted, and the determination to put this into action. By 1897 he would have seen, had he lived, the success of his plan, as adoring crowds celebrated Victoria's Diamond Jubilee and statues erected to the Queen Empress across the dominions and colonies. He did not view the empire merely as a theatrical spectacular. He was also interested in its material reality, and he was determined to make it stronger, sturdier, and more vigorous. In this, perhaps his biggest coup was the purchase of the shares in the Suez Canal owned by the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, who ruled from 1863 to 1879, when he was toppled by the British. By 1875, the Khedive was effectively bankrupt and in great need of money. He had mortgaged his interest until 1895, and Disraeli feared that this situation might have allowed the French to take control of the canal, as they already owned 56% of the ordinary shares outstanding. The canal, which opened in 1869, rendered the old shipping routes around the Cape of Good Hope at a stroke redundant. It made the route from India to the UK shorter by thousands of miles and many weeks, and it not only facilitated trade, but also rapid troop shipments in the event of a second Indian mutiny. Disraeli understood that the canal was the most vital artery of empire, and now brought off a great coup to buy the Khedive's shares and to assume control of the canal itself. According to Blake's account, Disraeli visited Lionel de Rothschild in a theatrical whirl and requested a loan of £4 million. This unorthodox approach was necessary because Parliament was not sitting, so that the normal and cheaper process of raising money was not available at a political moment when time was of the essence. When did Disraeli need the money? Tomorrow. What is your security? The British government. You shall have it. Disraeli, in other words, was able to leave office in 1880 for the last time with a sense that the nation, the empire, and the monarchy were in good heart. In his whole career, Disraeli saw one thing with great clarity, and acted upon his knowledge both in theory and in practice. Although he romanticised the aristocracy, not least in his explanation of his own origins, he knew that a democratic society that was developing would depend on the multitude being successfully engaged. This in turn involved symbolism, something he understood exceptionally well, hence the time and effort he spent on winning Victoria's favour. In this he differed markedly from some of his predecessors. Palmerston, for example, did not care to engage in such schemes because he considered that power had passed from the Crown to an oligarchy, even if a popular one. Disraeli did care because he realised that the people could have an affection for a monarchy that they were unlikely to feel for politicians, and his understanding still provides a backbone of stability to the nation today. Empire fulfilled a similar role. It was an idea all classes could rejoice at and take pride in, and was an idea that required practicality and concrete reality to make it work. Most importantly, he knew that the condition of the people, of overwhelming significance compared to symbolism, had to be improved regardless of whether they were voters or not. The vast expansion of the electorate in 1867 fitted with Disraeli's long-expressed views, yet even if it had been as much influenced by chance as his detractors would suggest, he recognised that the millions still disenfranchised needed to see their lives improve. This explains the message contained not only in his early novels, but in his speeches and legislative programme too. Add to this campaigning and administrative reforms he set in place to put the Tories ahead of the game for years to come, and a politician for all seasons emerges. The father, perhaps, of the democracy that is enjoyed today.